Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we look at the injustice of plea bargaining and the dangers of the dismal science. In the second half of our show, we'll speak with Donald Boudreau, professor of economics at George Mason University, who blogs under the handle Cafe Hayek. Up first, we'd like to welcome Stephanos Bibas, former federal prosecutor, professor of law and criminology at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and the author of The Machinery of Criminal Justice. Stephanos, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Stephanos, we've done several shows on criminal justice reform, but we haven't yet dealt with the subject of plea bargaining or prison reform. I asked you on because those are your sweet spots, both as a former prosecutor and as a law professor. Start out by taking us back. Take us back to colonial America, which gave birth to the constitutional right to a trial by a jury of your peers. What did the criminal justice system look like back then?
It was very different from what we have today, Bill. It was basically a shouting match, a morality play in front of the community. You had the victim saying, "He stole my pig," and the defendant saying, "No, you borrowed it from me." There were no lawyers. There were no law schools here. Everything was done very quickly, the day after the accusation, and it was done in public. It was done before the neighbors who knew everybody. The jury was a jury of the people from this neighborhood, and they'd say, yes, he did it, no, he didn't. The other thing the jury did was they decided how wrongful something was. Often the defendant would say, yes, I stole it, but I was hungry, have mercy on me. And so the jury was both deciding what actually happened and what he deserved. And when they discovered that someone had in fact done something wrong, they'd blame him and they'd punish him. But it was very quick. And the point was we were punishing the crime, not ostracizing the criminal. So we look back and you read the Scarlet Letter and you think, oh, how horrible this is. But the point is, after a few hours in the stocks or the pillory or having people jeer at you, the person would usually get out, go home, go back to his farm and his family. And so the punishment fell on the criminal. It didn't fall on his friends, his children, his wife. And he wasn't in a status as a permanent ex-con. You would punish the crime and then it was over with, and we knew how to forgive. And often the person would say he was sorry, and the community would then forgive and welcome back, and people went on to be politicians, to get married. All the evidence is that this was a very temporary thing. Lots of people did things wrong. They got punished. They took their lumps. They paid their debt to society. They repaid the victim, and then they went back to ordinary life.
But what about habitual criminals? There must have been habitual criminals back then.
Sure there were, but there was a small sliver. I mean, people think the colonial days were very bloody. There were a lot of things that were supposedly capital crimes, but the death penalty on average, maybe 2 people a year in Pennsylvania got sentenced to the death penalty. Only 1 a year actually got carried out. So there were some highway bandits, et cetera, who eventually got themselves hanged or exiled. But that was a tiny sliver. Most people, they're good people who sometimes do bad things. They're weak-willed. They get drunk. They do dumb things. And society knew that it could differentiate that. In fact, the way that the punishments worked in England and America, you'd brand somebody on the thumb so you could tell, had this person committed highway robbery before. And the first-timer was never going to get hanged for that. The person who was a professional criminal who had been branded, you could tell this person had done it before, was in a different category. And so they drew distinctions that we don't draw when we decide we're just fed up with people or with crime.
When did professional police, prosecutors, and judges come into the picture?
Really, this changes around the 19th century. You get law schools established in America. You get professional prosecutors taking over as a system across the 19th century. You'd had, in homicide cases, the victim couldn't prosecute. In isolated cases where you needed a prosecutor before that. But it's over the course of the 19th century that the prosecutors steadily displaced the victims. The victims used to have their day in court, and that was very good for them to get it off their chest and be empowered and state their accusation. But the prosecutors displaced them, they silenced them, and police, they get established in London in the 1820s. Professional police forces start happening over the middle of the 19th century here in America. And there are advantages to that.
Sure.
I mean, you had bumbling night watchmen and constables before that who often weren't very good. They weren't, consistently on duty. But there are downsides, too. When you have a lawyer who's taking the place of the victim, on the one hand, you might say the victim's not going to be so vengeful, and that's probably a good thing to temper the victim who's unusually bloodthirsty. On the other hand, these prosecutors, they've seen it all before, they become jaded, they have their own private law practices to get back to, and so their interest is in getting cases over with and less in making sure that justice is done in particular cases. Not that they're bad people, but they just kind of get used to the system.
Your book, The Machinery of Criminal Justice, talks about the divide between insiders and outsiders in the system. Explain that.
I think that's a hugely important thing to understand the modern criminal justice bureaucracy. You have people, primarily lawyers, who run the system, who work inside it, and they're the ones who took over the 19th century. The prosecutors, the defense lawyers, the judges, who now all are former lawyers. It didn't used to be. The police, the probation officers, etc. On the one hand, they're professionals, and so maybe they don't get carried away with private vengeance, but they can become jaded, they can become hardened, and their interest is in just getting their dockets over with. And they have huge dockets to deal with and a lot of pressures. It's understandable. At the same time, they can also be cold and unfeeling sometimes. And, it's just another burglary, as opposed to something that really terrified the victim. He's just another burglar, as opposed to somebody whose life really needs something to turn it around. And so I think they're well-meaning people. They get into the system mostly because they want to do justice, but they grow out of touch. And then the outsiders are the victims, the members of the community, the witnesses, the families, at least the first-time defendants before they become maybe habituated recidivists. And they're mystified. They think the system ought to be about right and wrong, and law school tries to tamp that down, if not drum it out of you. They expect justice. They expect jury trials like they see on TV, and then they don't see them happening. And so there's this frustration that sets in. The outsiders think, this is my case. I'm the victim. I'm the defendant. Why am I not speaking? And the insiders, the lawyer's attitude is, why are you talking? Be quiet. I'm going to deal with the lawyer across the table. I know how to get this case over with, and it's better for everybody if we just move it on the assembly line and move on to the next case. So it's more like a factory and less like a morality play or moral theater.
So what is plea bargaining, and how did it become so predominant?
All right. Plea bargaining didn't start until the 19th century, and nowadays it's 95% of cases.
Wow.
So you have a prosecutor who has far more cases than he can handle, right? And there's so many things that are crimes now, and police can arrest so many people. They bring a bunch of them in, and the prosecutor says, hey, I know other thefts all wind up getting probation the first time and then a month or two the second time. So I'm going to go to this defense lawyer, the public defender I work with all the time. We all know this case is going to wind up being a probation case. Why should we go through the motions and the theatrics in court? We go over there, we strike a deal. The defendant doesn't say anything. The victim doesn't have to be disrupted and miss work, come to court, etc. The judge is happy to move the docket. So for all the people inside the system, it's efficient, it's fast, it's quick, it's cheap, and that's its main virtue. And it's relatively certain and predictable. But the outsiders care about more than just business as usual. They want their day in court. They want to be vindicated. They want things like admissions of guilt and remorse and apologies and forgiveness. And plea bargaining doesn't care about that. That has no cash value, and it slows things down when victims get involved and when defendants get involved. And so from the point of view of the insiders, if you want to maximize the number of criminals, you stamp a criminal record on, move along, move them off from jail over to prison more quickly, it looks great. But let's say you're a rape victim, for example, and you have a defendant who takes a hurried plea, doesn't admit guilt or admits guilt very grudgingly or reads some scripted statement written by his lawyer. You never get to say anything in court, or maybe you get to say something after the plea bargain's been rubber stamped. That can be a very frustrating thing for a victim who feels like, well, the system victimized me again.
Well, you've written that pleas without confessions leave victims unvindicated and defendants defiant and resistant to treatment. How so?
Well, let's take the most extreme example. Most states allow a defendant to plead guilty without even grudgingly admitting guilt. That's called the no contest plea. Most states also allow a defendant to say, I'm not guilty, but I'm going to plead as if I'm guilty. And that's called an Alford plea. And from the point of view of the insiders, well, this is great. These are difficult cases. These people are stubborn. Let's move them along. We'll get their punishment. What's there not to like? But step back and look at it the way a victim would, or a member of the public would. The first thing is, you might be railroading an innocent person, you know? That might only be a few percent or a fraction of a percent of people, but these are still human beings. We ought to take more care to make sure they're guilty. But let's assume there's really good proof. Let's say there's DNA or videotape. And so even if we think the person really is guilty and he's just in denial, what's the problem with not making that rapist admit it? The rapist who's going around telling everybody it was date rape, she asked for it, she really wanted it, etc. So I interviewed some judges who took these cases, and they said, well, the rapist comes in, he says, I'm taking an Alford plea on the advice of my lawyer, and then it comes time for sentencing. And the defendant goes back to his friends and family and says, I'm just taking this because my lawyer told me to do it, I'm innocent. And the family says to the victim, you slut! Why are you making our poor son into a criminal? How dare you? And the victim is busy defending herself. Or this child molested victim is feeling like, what did I do wrong? I was hurt and now I'm being blamed. And there's one other big effect. It's not just that the defendant's family thinks the wrong thing and he's kind of hoodwinked them and the public thinks they might have railroaded an innocent person. The defendant himself is often in denial. If you've committed a shameful crime, like a child molestation, you have a hard time admitting it to yourself. How could I be a child molester? It was non-sexual. We were just playing around. That person gets to prison. And if you know anything about Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-step programs, one of the 12 steps to get into treatment is you got to admit you have a problem to fix it. Well, these guys get to prison. The judges have reinforced their denials to let them go by. The defense lawyers have reinforced the denial. And suddenly, they are not eligible for treatment because they can't bring themselves to say, yeah, I molested a kid. And so they're at much greater likelihood of coming out and doing it again, as opposed to the system saying, look, either you admit you did it, or we're going to go through a full jury trial and lay all the evidence out in full detail in the hopes that we can get through to you and we can make it clear to the public that you're really guilty.
So, Stephanos, this has pretty wide implications on the whole community.
Yeah. Neighbors and friends are scared and angry when there's a crime. Often the defendants are relatives, friends, and coworkers. They need to go back to living with these people. They're usually going to come out. And the system needs to show them that justice has been done and he's paid his debt to society. And plea bargaining hides that away.
Stephanos, let's move on to prison reform. The prevailing narrative is that the U.S. leads the world in mass incarceration because of the war on drugs and what author Michelle Alexander has called the new Jim Crow that has locked up a hugely disproportionate number of young black males. Remind us how that narrative is constructed.
Sure. So President Obama says that mass incarceration is here because of mandatory drug sentences and that's what's filling our prisons. And he leans on people like Michelle Alexander who say that this comes out of a racist conspiracy to control young black men. And the facts just don't line up. The first thing is less than a fifth of the people in prison are there primarily because of a drug crime. A slight majority are in for a violent crime. When you put violent and property crimes together, it's about 2/3 of the people who are in. And the other thing that gets lost is that the people who were behind drug sentencing and the war on drugs, this was bipartisan. It was cross-racial. It was representatives from Harlem, people like Charlie Rangel, other black representatives, black newspapers like the Amsterdam News, the NAACP's committee, all wanted help fighting the crack epidemic in their communities. Yeah. From the early 70s through the mid-80s, these neighborhoods are being ravaged. And what people forget is not only are blacks disproportionately convicted of crimes, blacks are disproportionately victims of crimes. Most crime is interracial, which means whatever black defendants are getting punished are predominantly hurting other blacks in the neighborhoods. And so criminal justice enforcement helps as well as hurts. It may be true that many people have changed their minds about the war on drugs. It may be true that now we have things to regret, or in hindsight, we might want to adjust it. But it is revisionist history to blame this on racism. This was bipartisan. was cross-racial. It wasn't a racist conspiracy.
So just because a liberal narrative on mass incarceration may not be right, does that make the status quo right?
No, it doesn't. The problem is not that there was racial bias driving it. And of course, there may have been individually racist people and, Nixon's Southern strategy, but that's not the dominant thing going on here. The problem is not that. The problem is that we're throwing away a lot of human beings who are fathers, who are husbands, who are brothers, who are friends. And it is big government that's doing it. And so conservatives can't pat themselves on the back. Prison guard unions are special interests that manipulate prison funding and the California Three Strikes Initiative. The police unions have a big stake in a lot of this. And if you look at the way cities are doing enforcement, a lot of it is greed. I think that's one of the legitimate things in Ferguson, Missouri, that Ferguson was busy using its cops to collect petty anti-fines from all the people in town, which is why they hated the police force, and it makes it illegitimate. And so if you're a black person in one of these neighborhoods, you may not want to cooperate with the police when they need a witness, when they need the citizens and the neighbors to help out. But for too long, it's been us versus them, insiders versus outsiders, and that is not healthy.
And one of the points you make in your book, The Machinery of Criminal Justice, is that prison punishment has essentially become hidden from the public, separated from the community. What do you mean by that?
Punishment used to be public, and it used to be temporary in the stocks or the pillory. But we moved people behind prison walls, starting in the 19th century, and it seemed less bloody and more humane. But number one, out of sight, out of mind meant the public never saw the barbarism that happens behind prison walls, the rapes and the stabbings, etc. Number two, it meant we separated people from their families, wives, children, jobs, the things that tend to keep people on a law-abiding course.
Right.
And so when they get out, we let them out. They do no work while they're inside, because during the Depression, businesses and unions got together to stamp out prison work that would compete with them. So we let them out with no job skills and with a bus ticket and $20, and then we're surprised that they go back to drug dealing on the corner and that they don't have the families that are the key things to make them settle down. As we know, with young men, getting married and taking care of children are prime things that keep them on the straight and narrow. And most people, before they went to prison, actually were in some way contributing to or taking care of their children. Those are things a conservative pro-family policy ought to build on and help with, as opposed to severing those kinds of ties to work and family and church.
Well, what about the deterrence argument? Isn't prison supposed to be horrible because it deters people from committing crimes?
I have never met a criminal defendant who was a fully informed, rational actor in the years that I prosecuted. Think about it. There are a few crimes that are rational, and you could probably deter speeders by having highway patrols, but what kind of person is going to risk getting shot or arrested in order to steal $300 and a six-pack of beer from a convenience store? These are short-sighted gamblers, and 2/3 of them either have mental illness, drug abuse, or alcohol abuse. And so these are not people who are thinking clearly. What they need is to be prevented from committing crime or scared off by something very visible, right? If the police are right there, you're not going to commit the crime. But if the threat is an uncertain chance of being arrested and then having a heavy sentence much later, people are going to think, I'm not going to get caught, and then that long prison sentence doesn't really deter them.
So, Stephanos, you mentioned the role of idleness in contemporary prison life. How can meaningful work change the rehabilitation dynamics?
In prison, people spend a lot of time pumping iron and building up their muscles, or watching TV, or getting into fights, but they rarely get to work. Federal law forbids them to make items that get sold in interstate commerce. There are a few places that are different. The federal government has them make some furniture for government use. Texas and Louisiana have them make things for state use or work on some farms. And prisoners want to do this. They want something both to give them a purpose and occupy their time, but also to build some skills. And so what I think we ought to do is repeal the ban on prison work and make it a win-win for everybody. Have prisoners earn some wages, right? And don't insist that they get paid, the private wages, which make them unmarketable because it's expensive for these companies to operate in prison. Let some of their wages go to pay their victims, Let some of their wages go to support their families, because they ought to take responsibility for their families on the outside. Let some of it cover the cost of housing. It's not going to cover nearly enough, but it's still important that they contribute. And then give them some as an incentive for them to work. And I particularly like the idea of doing this in conjunction with some of these private charitable foundations. There's Prison Fellowship Ministries is one of these religious church ministries where a congregation partners up with the church. And of course it has to be voluntary because it's a church. But if they're willing to volunteer for it, people come in from a local congregation and they view it as their mission to pray with people, to keep an eye on them. And then when they come on to the outside, to help them get a job, to help them get an apartment.
Yeah, they have a buddy.
Yeah, they have a buddy so that they go into a pizza delivery job or something like that when they come out, as opposed to going into drug dealing. I even play with the idea of going back to an old tradition of allowing convicts to go into the military. You know, some people have serious violent tendencies.
I don't think the military is going to want them in today's day and age.
Oh, it would be hard. It wouldn't be easy. But if you ever watch the movie The Dirty Dozen, we used to do this. Most societies used to do this. And it could do some good as long as you started people at a lower level, with not on the same level as law-abiding servicemen, and let them earn their way up. Because, frankly, a lot of people in prison, they're slackers. They had very little discipline in their lives, and making them do push-ups and scrub latrines and learn some kind of structure in their lives can actually help them to turn their lives around.
Boot camp might do them some good.
The example I point to is Israel. This is the way Israel integrates immigrants into its society, right? And you say, can the military have this social role? But actually, people with lots of different languages and lots of different backgrounds come in, and they learn and they assimilate. And the Israeli military is still a very effective fighting force. So, sure, you don't want an all-prison unit, but if you seed them carefully and you screen out the ones who are just too dangerous to allow in, it actually has worked and can work again.
What are the strengths and weaknesses of probation and parole, and how can modern technology be used to make both more effective?
So probation right now is a joke. The average probation officer is juggling several hundred cases and can't meaningfully watch somebody. And there are all these technical conditions, but basically someone calls, checks in, they have no idea what's going on with people's lives. What you need to do is have a system that keeps people from using drugs and from going to dangerous locations. You know, late Friday night, late Saturday night is when a lot of crimes happen. When people get drunk, they get high, they go out with their friends, and they get into fights or they drive drunk or whatever. There are experiments in places like Hawaii of intensive probation where you take somebody who has a drug problem and you say, we are going to do a random urinalysis on you 1 day a week. You're going to phone in every morning, and if it's your day, you pee into a cup. And if you have a dirty urine this day, you are going to jail for Saturday and Sunday. So instead of counting on rational deterrence by a possible far-off long sentence, we're making it very predictable and very likely that you're going to do an unpleasant weekend in jail. So this does a couple things. Number one, it makes it very immediate and concrete. Number two, it makes the sanction short enough that you don't lose your job or your family or your apartment. And what they've discovered is with the hardest core caseload out there, 85% of people go clean immediately. So the narrative that most people need expensive inpatient drug treatment for 6 months or a year isn't true. Most people, if they have a rational threat right in front of them and that immediate, actually stop. And then you have the slice of the 10 or 15% who have a dirty urine or two who you need to keep tabs on very closely. But that you shrink the caseload such that you can really work on that 10% and you can manage people much more effectively. But the point is it has to be swift, it has to be certain, it has to be immediate to deal with otherwise gambling, short-sighted probationers. What
role can offenders' families play in criminal justice?
Families are important to keep people on the straight and narrow. And sure, not, a lot of guys are young single guys, and some of them aren't married, but some of them are married or have stable long-term relationships. Many of them have children. And the responsibility of being there for your kids is important. Having your mom looking over your shoulder or your pastor or somebody is very important because they still have shame in their eyes. And so one of the things I suggest is if you have sentencing circles or victim offender mediation where the victim tells the story and the mother and the pastor and the sixth grade teacher, hear these things, there are people who can hold them accountable. Just like in Alcoholics Anonymous, other people in the group have to hold you accountable. That's the kind of social safety net and structure that they need to be kept honest. So families are one part of it. The other part is technology. And now GPS is so cheap. Ankle bracelets, every smartphone has GPS in it. You can have people check in via a smartphone. You can have a virtual curfew that keeps them from going out late at night, Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, but lets them go to work, lets them go to school. A lot cheaper and a lot less intrusive than locking them up in jail. And these are ways in which we can really limit ourselves to the fraction of people for whom just a curfew is not enough. But keeping people off drugs, off alcohol, making sure they're taking their mental health medications will take care of a lot of it.
Stephanos, in both your arguments to limit excess plea bargaining and your recommendations for prison reform, you seem to want to bring back an everyday understanding of morality into the picture. Are Americans who have become so accustomed to what you call amoral processes ready for something like that?
Americans still have a basic sense of what's right and what's wrong. Even most criminal defendants do. They know it's wrong to hurt somebody, to steal from somebody. And they want the system to speak and proclaim that. Instead, what we get is mathematical gobbledygook and lawyer technicalities, which leave everybody thinking this is a game. As long as it's a game, it's not going to have legitimacy in the eyes of criminal defendants and convicts and victims and the public. They want to be told what's right, what's wrong, that there's condemnation and there's forgiveness, and that's how we can reunite people and reintegrate them into society and really move beyond crime.
Stephanos, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing really a very different view of the problem.
Thanks for having me on.
That was University of Pennsylvania Law School Professor Stephanos Bibas here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, stop by realclearradio.org and sign up for updates. Build your brand by aligning it with high-quality content on Real Clear Radio Hour. For corporate underwriting opportunities, contact producer at realclearradio.org. Ahead, we'll speak with George Mason economist Donald Boudreau about the dangers of the dismal science. Stay tuned.